September 19, 1944. The Texas sun beat down on the makeshift prisoner of war camp outside the small town of Fredericksburg with an intensity that seemed almost vindictive. 23 German women stepped off the military transport truck, their gray auxiliary uniforms dusty from the long journey from the East Coast Processing Center. They had been captured in France during the final Allied push, serving as radio operators and administrative personnel for the Wehrmacht. Now they found themselves in a landscape that seemed as alien as the moon itself. Elsa Hoffman, a 26-year-old former communications specialist from Munich, shielded her eyes against the glare and stared at the endless expanse of scrubland dotted with mesquite trees. The heat was different here than anything she had experienced in Europe. It was dry and relentless, sucking the moisture from her skin and making each breath feel like inhaling sand. Around her, the other women stood in silent uncertainty, their faces reflecting the same mixture of exhaustion and apprehension that she felt coursing through her own body. The camp itself was smaller than the sprawling facilities that housed male prisoners. A cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fencing, with a few administrative buildings and what appeared to be a communal dining hall. Guard towers stood at each corner, but Elsa noticed something odd. The American soldiers manning them seemed almost relaxed, lacking the hard-edged vigilance she had expected from her captors. Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Hayes, one of the few female officers in the USS Army assigned to oversee prisoner facilities, approached the group with an interpreter at her side. She was a tall woman in her early 40s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that seemed to see everything without revealing anything in return. She began speaking in English, her voice carrying authority but not cruelty. The interpreter, a nervous young man with wire-rimmed glasses, translated her words into careful German. The women would be housed in Barracks 3 and 4. They would be expected to maintain the facility, work in the camp gardens, and assist with various domestic duties. They would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They would be safe here. Elsa listened to these words with the same detached acceptance she had cultivated since her capture. Safety was a relative concept when you were a prisoner in enemy territory, thousands of miles from everything you had ever known. But then something unexpected happened. As Lieutenant Colonel Hayes finished her introductory speech, a tall man in civilian clothes approached from one of the nearby buildings. He wore dusty boots, weathered jeans, and a Stetson hat that marked him as unmistakably Texan. His face was weathered by sun and wind, creased with lines that spoke of years spent outdoors. He nodded respectfully to Hayes, then turned his attention to the German women with an expression that Elsa could not quite read. It was not hostility, but it was not exactly welcome either. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like curiosity mixed with an emotion she had not expected to see, directed at prisoners of war. It looked almost like hope. The man in the Stetson hat removed it briefly, revealing salt and pepper hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He introduced himself through the interpreter as Jack Brennan, foreman of the Triple Creek Ranch that bordered the camp property. His presence seemed incongruous in this military setting, and Elsa found herself wondering why a civilian rancher would be standing before a group of enemy prisoners with such an earnest expression on his weathered face. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes gestured for Brennan to speak, and he cleared his throat awkwardly before beginning. The interpreter struggled to keep pace with his drawling English, translating haltingly into German. Brennan explained that the local ranching community had an arrangement with the camp administration. The prisoners would be allowed to work on nearby farms and ranches, helping with the labor shortage that had crippled Texas agriculture since so many young men had shipped overseas to fight. In return, the prisoners would receive small wages and better rations than standard military provisions. Elsa exchanged glances with the other women. The concept seemed almost absurd. They were prisoners of war, captured while serving the Third Reich, and yet they were being offered paid work on American ranches. It contradicted everything they had been told about American brutality and the harsh treatment awaiting those who fell into enemy hands. Around her, she could see the same confusion reflected in her companions' faces. Some looked suspicious, others merely exhausted and indifferent to whatever fate awaited them. But Brennan was not finished speaking. He shifted his weight from one boot to the other, a gesture that struck Elsa as oddly vulnerable for such a large man. Then he said something that made the interpreter pause and ask for clarification before translating. Brennan was looking for women who knew how to bake traditional German pastries. Specifically, he wanted someone who could make authentic apple strudel. His voice carried a note of something Elsa could not quite identify. It was not quite desperation, but it was close. It sounded almost like longing. The request hung in the air like something tangible. Several of the women began whispering among themselves in rapid German. What kind of strange country was this, where enemy prisoners were asked not to labor in fields or factories, but to bake desserts? Where cowboys came to prison camps seeking recipes rather than revenge? Elsa felt a bubble of something that might have been laughter or hysteria rising in her chest, but she suppressed it. Brennan's eyes scanned the group hopefully, landing briefly on each face, as if trying to read their capabilities through their expressions alone. Elsa found herself remembering Sunday afternoons in her grandmother's kitchen in Munich. The smell of cinnamon and apples filling the small apartment, flour dusting every surface like fresh snow. She remembered the careful process of stretching the dough until it was thin enough to read newspaper through, the precise folding technique that kept the filling perfectly enclosed. Before she could stop herself, before she could think about what it might mean, Elsa raised her hand. Jack Brennan's face lit up with an expression of such genuine relief that Elsa almost lowered her hand in embarrassment. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly and gestured for Elsa to step forward from the group. Her legs felt unsteady as she moved, hyper-aware of 22 pairs of eyes watching her from behind and the intense scrutiny of the Americans before her. The interpreter asked her name and background, translating her responses for Brennan and Hayes. Elsa explained in halting sentences that her grandmother had been a baker in Munich, famous in their neighborhood for her pastries. Elsa had spent countless hours learning the old woman's techniques, the traditional recipes passed down through generations. Apple strudel, plum kuchen, black forest cake. She knew them all by heart, could measure ingredients by feel rather than numbers, understood the temperament of dough the way some people understood music. Brennan stepped closer, his boots kicking up small clouds of Texas dust. Through the interpreter, he explained that his own grandmother had been German, immigrated to Texas in 1897 from a small village near Stuttgart. She had brought her recipes with her, maintaining her culinary traditions even as she adapted to this harsh new landscape. Brennan had grown up eating her strudel every Sunday after church, the flaky pastry and spiced apples representing his only connection to a nut heritage he had never fully understood. His grandmother had passed away 3 years earlier, taking her recipes with her. She had never written them down, insisting that cooking was something you learned through touch and instinct rather than measurements and instructions. Brennan had tried to recreate her strudel countless times, but it never tasted right. The dough was too thick or too thin, the filling too sweet or too bland, the texture all wrong. He missed it with an intensity that surprised him, this simple pastry that represented love and tradition and belonging. Now, with the war raging across Europe and German prisoners arriving in Texas, Brennan had conceived of what he admitted was probably a foolish idea. Perhaps one of these women might know how to make strudel the way his grandmother had. Perhaps food could bridge the gap that war had created. Perhaps in the simple act of baking together, enemies might discover they were not so different after all. Elsa listened to this explanation with growing astonishment. She had expected many things from American captivity: harsh labor, poor conditions, indifference at best, and cruelty at worst. She had not expected a cowboy to stand before her with tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, talking about his grandmother's baking with the reverence most men reserved for matters of life and death. She had not expected to feel an unexpected surge of sympathy for this man who should have been her enemy. Through the interpreter, she heard herself saying something that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise everyone else. She would teach him. She would show him how to make proper strudel, not just for him, but because in this strange and alien place, baking something familiar might help her remember who she had been before the war consumed everything. 3 days later, Elsa found herself standing in the camp kitchen at dawn, an apron tied over her prisoner uniform. The kitchen was surprisingly well equipped for a military facility, with large commercial ovens, sturdy work tables, and shelves stocked with basic ingredients. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had arranged for additional supplies to be brought in specifically for this experiment. Flour, butter, apples from a nearby orchard, cinnamon, sugar, and even the fine breadcrumbs needed for authentic strudel. Jack Brennan arrived precisely at 6 in the morning, accompanied by 2 other ranchers who had heard about the arrangement and wanted to witness this unusual cultural exchange. One was an older man named Frank Sutton, whose leathery face suggested he had spent every day of his 60-some years under the Texas sun. The other was younger, perhaps 30, introduced as Michael Chen, whose family had immigrated from China 2 generations earlier and now owned a successful vegetable farm near Fredericksburg. The presence of other prisoners had also been arranged. 3 women, who had volunteered to assist Elsa, stood nervously near the far counter. Among them was Clara Weber, a quiet blonde from Hamburg who had mentioned she knew how to make proper puff pastry, and Greta Newman, a sturdy woman from Bavaria who had worked in her family's restaurant before the war. The third was a young girl named Liesel Braun, barely 20 years old, who seemed more curious than skilled but eager to participate in anything that broke the monotony of camp routine. An awkward silence filled the kitchen as the 2 groups regarded each other. Elsa could feel the weight of history pressing down on the moment. These men represented the nation that had defeated hers, that had captured her and transported her thousands of miles from home. She represented the regime that had plunged the world into catastrophic war, that had brought death and destruction across continents. And yet they were gathering to bake pastry together as if such things mattered more than politics and conflict. Elsa took a deep breath and began speaking in her limited English, supplemented by gestures when words failed. She directed Brennan to bring flour to the table, showed him how to create a well in the center for the water and oil. Her hands moved with practiced confidence as she demonstrated the mixing technique, how to knead the dough just enough to develop elasticity without making it tough. Brennan watched intently, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he attempted to replicate her movements. The other women began preparing the filling, peeling and slicing apples into thin crescents, mixing them with sugar and cinnamon, and those essential breadcrumbs that would absorb excess moisture during baking. The kitchen filled with the familiar sense of Elsa's childhood, and she felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. For the first time since her capture, she was doing something that felt like living rather than merely surviving. Brennan caught her eye across the table and smiled tentatively. Despite everything, despite the impossible circumstances, Elsa found herself smiling back. The dough had to rest for 30 minutes, covered with a warm cloth to keep it pliable. During this waiting period, an unexpected conversation began. Brennan, perhaps trying to fill the silence, started talking about his grandmother. Her name had been Wilhelmina, he explained through a mixture of simple English and the gestures that were becoming their shared language. She had left Germany as a young bride, following her husband to Texas with nothing but a single trunk of belongings and a head full of recipes. Elsa found herself responding, telling him about her own grandmother, Rosa, who had survived the First World War by baking bread for whoever could pay, regardless of their politics or religion. Rosa had believed that food transcended the divisions that tore people apart. A hungry person was simply a hungry person, she would say, not a German or a Frenchman, not a Catholic or a Jew, just someone who needed sustenance and perhaps a moment of comfort in a difficult world. Clara joined the conversation tentatively, sharing memories of helping her mother prepare Christmas stollen every December, the kitchen warm and fragrant while snow fell outside their Hamburg apartment. Greta spoke about her family's restaurant in a small Bavarian village, how they had served the same recipes for 3 generations until the war came and changed everything. Even young Liesel, who had admitted she barely knew how to boil water before arriving at the camp, talked about watching her aunt bake pretzels for the local market. Frank Sutton surprised everyone by revealing that his own mother had been born in Ireland, and he remembered her making soda bread every Saturday without fail. Michael Chen spoke quietly about his grandmother's dumpling-making skills, how she had adapted traditional Chinese recipes using Texas ingredients when her preferred items were unavailable. The conversation expanded beyond German baking, becoming a sharing of culinary heritage that seemed to matter more in this moment than the war raging across oceans. When the dough had rested sufficiently, Elsa demonstrated the most crucial and difficult part of the strudel-making process. She dusted a clean cloth with flour and began stretching the dough, working from the center outward with the backs of her hands, pulling gently but firmly until it became translucent. This was where most attempts failed, she explained. Too much force would tear the dough, too little would leave it thick and heavy. It required patience and feel, an understanding that came from practice rather than instruction. Brennan tried next, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he worked. The dough tore slightly, and Elsa quickly moved to his side, her hands covering his to guide the motion. For a moment, prisoner and captor worked together, their hands moving in unison to repair the damage and continue stretching. Neither seemed to notice the symbolic nature of the gesture, focused entirely on the task before them. But Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, watching from the doorway, saw it clearly. She saw the beginning of something that transcended the boundaries of war, something as simple and profound as shared humanity expressed through the universal language of food. The strudel emerged from the oven golden and perfect, its surface glazed with butter and dusted with powdered sugar. The aroma that filled the kitchen was transcendent, cutting through the institutional smells of the camp and replacing them with something that spoke of home and comfort and memories too precious to forget. Brennan stood transfixed, his eyes closed as he breathed in the scent that had haunted him for 3 years since his grandmother's death. When Elsa cut the first slice and placed it on a plate before him, his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the fork. The first bite seemed to transport him somewhere else entirely. His weathered face softened, lines of worry and responsibility temporarily erased by the taste of childhood Sunday afternoons. He chewed slowly, savoring every nuance of flavor and texture. Then he set down his fork and did something that stunned everyone in the kitchen. Tears began rolling down his cheeks unchecked. He made no effort to hide them or wipe them away. He simply sat there, a grown man crying over pastry while enemy prisoners and fellow Americans watched in awkward silence. Finally, he spoke in a voice thick with emotion. It was exactly right, exactly as he remembered. His grandmother would make it after church every Sunday, and the whole family would gather around her table. His grandfather would tell stories about the ranch. His mother would laugh at jokes that weren't particularly funny. His younger sister would sneak extra pieces when she thought no one was watching. Those Sundays had represented everything good about his childhood, everything that felt safe and permanent in a world that he now understood was neither. His grandmother's kitchen had been a sanctuary where the outside world's troubles could not reach, where love was expressed through carefully rolled dough and precisely spiced filling. When she died, he had felt like he lost more than a person. He had lost a connection to something essential about himself, about where he came from, and what mattered most. Frank Sutton cleared his throat uncomfortably and looked away, but Michael Chen moved closer and placed a hand on Brennan's shoulder in silent understanding. Elsa felt her own eyes burning with unexpected tears. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen in Munich, wondered if it still existed, or if Allied bombs had reduced it to rubble. She thought about all the Sunday afternoons she had taken for granted, assuming they would continue forever. She thought about how food carried memories in ways that photographs and letters could not, how a taste could transport you across years and oceans to moments you thought were lost forever. Clara began cutting more slices, distributing them to everyone present. The German women and American men sat together around the kitchen table, eating strudel and sharing a moment of communion that transcended nationality and circumstance. No one spoke about the war or their roles in it. No one mentioned that some were prisoners and others guards. They simply ate and remembered and recognized in each other the universal human need to hold on to the past, even while facing an uncertain future. The success of the strudel experiment changed something fundamental in the camp's atmosphere. Word spread quickly through both the prisoner population and the local community. Within a week, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was fielding requests from other ranchers and townspeople who wanted to participate in similar exchanges. Some wanted to learn German recipes, others simply wanted to meet these enemy prisoners who seemed less like monsters and more like ordinary women facing extraordinary circumstances. Hayes approached Elsa with a proposal. Would she be willing to organize regular baking sessions, teaching both traditional German recipes and learning American ones in return? The sessions would involve more prisoners and more locals, creating a structured program that might benefit everyone involved. The prisoners would develop useful skills, earn small wages, and break the crushing monotony of camp life. The locals would gain help with domestic production and perhaps learn that their enemies were more complex than propaganda had suggested. Elsa agreed, but with a condition that surprised Hayes. She wanted the sessions to be genuinely reciprocal. She did not want to simply perform German culture for American consumption. She wanted to learn American recipes as well, to understand the food traditions of this strange country where she now found herself imprisoned. Hayes considered this request carefully before nodding her approval. "Fair exchange," she said. "Teaching and learning flowing in both directions, rather than one group simply extracting knowledge from the other." The first expanded session took place the following Tuesday. 8 German women joined Elsa in the kitchen, along with 6 American civilians, including 2 ranch wives who had heard about the program. One of them, a woman named Dorothy Martinez, whose husband managed a cattle operation near San Antonio, brought her own family recipes passed down from her Mexican grandmother. She spoke enthusiastically about tamales and pan dulce, about how food had helped her family maintain their heritage while adapting to Texas life. The other ranch wife, Helen Kowalski, was Polish by heritage and brought recipes for pierogi and babka. She explained how her parents had immigrated to Chicago before moving to Texas, how they had clung to their food traditions as a way of preserving identity in a new land. As she spoke, Elsa realized that nearly everyone in the kitchen had some story of displacement, of families crossing oceans and borders, of recipes serving as bridges between old worlds and new ones. They decided to work in pairs. Each German woman partnered with an American civilian. Elsa found herself working alongside Dorothy Martinez, learning to make flour tortillas while teaching Dorothy the intricacies of making proper spatzel. The kitchen became a babel of languages and gestures, of laughter when translations went wrong and triumph when techniques were successfully demonstrated. Greta worked with Helen on pierogi, discovering that the Polish dumpling-making process was remarkably similar to German methods she already knew. Young Liesel, still more enthusiastic than skilled, partnered with a teenage girl from town whose mother had sent her to learn practical cooking skills. The 2 young women, barely different in age, giggled together over failed attempts and celebrated successful ones with the easy camaraderie of peers who had not yet learned to see each other as enemies first and people second. By October, the baking sessions had become a fixture of camp life, occurring 3 times weekly and involving nearly all the German women prisoners. But it was a particular batch of strudel made on October 12th that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the entire program. Jack Brennan had returned for another lesson, this time bringing his 10-year-old nephew Tommy, whose father was serving with Patton's Third Army somewhere in France. Tommy was a quiet boy, thin and serious beyond his years. His mother had died from influenza 2 years earlier, and with his father overseas, he lived with his grandmother, who struggled to care for him while managing her own grief and worry. Brennan had brought him, hoping the distraction might lift the boy's perpetual sadness. Tommy watched the baking process with solemn eyes, saying nothing but absorbing everything. Elsa noticed him standing apart from the activity, his small hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face carefully blank, in the way children learn to hide pain they could not express. Something about his isolation called to her own losses, her own carefully suppressed grief for everything the war had taken. She approached him slowly, kneeling to his level, and asked in her accented English if he would like to help her roll the dough. Tommy looked to his uncle for permission, then nodded silently. Elsa guided his hands through the process, showing him how to feel when the dough was ready, how to stretch it gently without tearing. She told him stories as they worked, translating her memories into simple English. She spoke about her younger brother Klaus, who had been Tommy's age when the war started and who loved to steal bits of raw dough when he thought no one was watching. Klaus, who was now somewhere on the Eastern Front, if he was still alive at all. Tommy listened intently, his hands moving with increasing confidence under her guidance. Then he asked a question that stopped all conversation in the kitchen. If her brother was fighting his father, did that make them enemies? Did that mean she wanted his father to die? The directness of childhood cut through all the careful diplomacy that adults had constructed around their situation. Everyone in the kitchen froze, waiting to see how Elsa would answer. She was silent for a long moment, her hands still covering Tommy's as they worked the dough. Then she spoke quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear. She did not want anyone to die, she said. Not his father, not her brother, not any of the young men fighting wars started by old men who would never face battle themselves. She wanted everyone to come home safely and never have to fight again. She wanted a world where people made strudel together instead of making war. Tommy considered this answer seriously, then asked if she would teach him to make strudel for his father when he came home. Something about the question, about this American child wanting to make German pastry for his soldier father, broke through the last of Elsa's careful, emotional defenses. She pulled Tommy into a hug, and the boy who had not cried since his mother's funeral began sobbing against her shoulder while she wept into his hair. The incident with Tommy Brennan created ripples that extended far beyond the kitchen. Several of the German women began writing letters home that night, carefully composed missives that would be read by military censors before being sent across the Atlantic. Elsa sat on her bunk with paper and pencil, trying to find words that could explain what was happening to her in this Texas prisoner of war camp. She wrote to her mother in Munich, describing the landscape and the people with careful neutrality at first. But as her pencil moved across the page, she found herself confessing things she had barely admitted to herself. The Americans were not what she had expected. They were not the cruel, heartless enemies that propaganda had painted. They were farmers and ranchers who missed their families, who cried over pastries that reminded them of their grandmothers, who worried about sons and brothers fighting overseas just as German families did. In the bunk below, Clara was writing her own letter to her sister in Hamburg. She described the absurdity of teaching American ranch wives to make proper German potato pancakes while learning to make something called chicken fried steak in return. She wrote about how strange it felt to laugh with women whose countrymen were bombing German cities, to share recipes and stories as if war did not exist outside the kitchen walls. Greta's letter to her parents in Bavaria was more troubled. She confessed feeling guilty for enjoying the cooking sessions, for looking forward to Tuesday and Thursday mornings when the kitchen would fill with activity and purpose. She had been taught that fraternizing with the enemy was betrayal, that maintaining hostile distance was a patriotic duty. Yet how could she maintain hatred toward Dorothy Martinez, who had patiently taught her to make tamales while sharing stories about her own son serving in the Pacific? How could she despise Helen Kowalski, whose Polish family had suffered under German occupation, but who nevertheless treated the German prisoners with genuine kindness? Young Liesel wrote to her fiancé, a soldier serving somewhere in Italy, about the confusion of finding friendship with enemy civilians while her beloved fought enemy soldiers. She wondered if the men he fought against had families who baked together, who cried over lost grandmothers, who were just as human as the people she met in the kitchen. The thought made her physically ill, forcing her to recognize that every enemy soldier her fiancé killed was someone's son, brother, or father. Someone who might have been kind in different circumstances. Not all the women wrote letters that night. Some, like a stern woman named Ingrid Vogel who kept apart from the baking sessions, believed that any friendliness toward Americans was collaboration, a betrayal of their duty as German citizens. She watched the others writing with obvious disapproval, muttering that they were forgetting who they were and why they were fighting. Her words planted seeds of doubt and guilt that would grow in the following weeks. The letters that were sent would take weeks to reach Germany, traveling through military postal systems and surviving the chaos of a continent at war. The responses, if they came at all, would reveal how differently the war appeared from opposite sides of the Atlantic, and how difficult it was becoming to maintain clear distinctions between enemy and friend. November brought cooler weather to Texas, though nothing like the sharp cold the German women remembered from European autumns. The mesquite trees turned golden, and the air carried the scent of burning leaves and harvested crops. The baking sessions had become an established routine, with 12 German prisoners now participating regularly, and the list of interested local participants growing longer each week. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes found herself managing something that resembled a cultural exchange program more than a prisoner of war facility. On November 7th, Jack Brennan arrived at the camp with an unusual request. The town of Fredericksburg held an annual harvest festival every year on the weekend before Thanksgiving, celebrating the German heritage that still dominated the local culture. Many of the founding families had emigrated from Germany in the 1850s, and they had maintained traditions that connected them to their ancestral homeland even after decades in Texas. The festival featured traditional music, dancing, crafts, and most importantly, food. The festival organizers wanted to invite the German prisoners to participate. They wanted authentic German baking to be part of the celebration, wanted these women who actually came from Germany to demonstrate traditional techniques and share their knowledge. Brennan admitted it was an unusual request, possibly inappropriate given the circumstances, but the town council had voted to extend the invitation anyway. They believed that culture and heritage transcended politics and war, that celebrating German traditions was not the same as supporting the Nazi regime. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called a meeting of all the German prisoners to discuss the proposal. She made clear that participation would be entirely voluntary. No one would be forced to attend, and choosing not to participate would carry no negative consequences. She also acknowledged the complexity of the situation. Some townspeople might resent their presence. Some prisoners might feel uncomfortable celebrating German culture while Germany was losing the war. Some might see it as collaboration or betrayal. The women discussed the invitation among themselves in rapid German, their voices rising and falling with emotion. Ingrid Vogel spoke against participation, arguing that they should maintain their dignity as German prisoners rather than performing their culture for American entertainment. Several others agreed with her, saying they felt like animals in a zoo being asked to demonstrate exotic behaviors for curious spectators. But Elsa spoke in favor of accepting the invitation. She argued that German culture was bigger than the current regime, that traditional baking and music and folk art belonged to the people, not to politicians or generals. Refusing to share their heritage out of political spite would mean letting the war destroy even the good things about being German. If they could remind Americans that German culture included beauty and craftsmanship and tradition, not just military aggression and warfare, perhaps they would be doing something valuable. Clara supported Elsa's position, pointing out that many of the Fredericksburg families were Germans who had left long before Hitler, before the wars, before everything went wrong. They had maintained their heritage in a new land, and maybe seeing how German culture could exist without nationalism and militarism would be instructive for everyone involved. The debate continued for 2 hours before Hayes called for a vote. Of the 23 prisoners, 15 voted to participate in the festival. 8 declined. The Harvest Festival opened on Saturday, November 18th, under clear blue skies that seemed impossibly vast compared to the gray European skies the German women remembered. Main Street in Fredericksburg had been transformed with booths selling crafts, produce, and baked goods. A bandstand had been erected in the town square, and colorful bunting hung between the buildings. The atmosphere was festive but carried an undercurrent of tension as the military trucks carrying the German prisoners arrived. Elsa and the 14 other women who had chosen to participate wore clean civilian dresses that local families had donated, replacing their prisoner uniforms for the day. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had arranged for a dozen armed guards to accompany them, but she had instructed the soldiers to remain as unobtrusive as possible. She wanted the women to feel like participants rather than prisoners, even though technically they remained both. The booth assigned to them was near the center of town, equipped with portable ovens that local bakeries had provided. The women had prepared dough the previous day, and they began the familiar process of making strudel, Lebkuchen, and stollen, while curious townspeople gathered to watch. Some observers were friendly, asking questions and offering encouragement. Others kept their distance, their expressions ranging from suspicious to openly hostile. An elderly woman named Gertrude Mueller approached the booth with tears streaming down her face. She spoke to Elsa in fluent German, explaining that she had left Bavaria as a young bride in 1898 and had not tasted proper strudel in 46 years. She watched Elsa's hands moving through the familiar motions and began describing her own mother's technique, the slight variations that marked regional differences. The two women talked for nearly an hour, bridging decades and oceans through shared culinary knowledge. But not all interactions were positive. A middle-aged man stopped at the booth and stared at the prisoners with undisguised anger. His son had died at Normandy, he announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. His boy had been killed by Germans, and now here were German women being treated like honored guests at an American festival. The injustice of it made him sick. He spat on the ground near their booth before walking away, leaving uncomfortable silence in his wake. Elsa felt her face burning with shame and anger. She wanted to shout that she had not killed anyone, that she had been a radio operator thousands of miles from any battlefield, that she mourned all the dead, regardless of nationality. But she remained silent, understanding that no words could bridge the chasm of his grief. Greta reached over and squeezed her hand in silent support. As the day progressed, music began playing from the bandstand. Traditional German folk songs mixed with American country music, creating a hybrid sound that reflected the cultural blending of Fredericksburg itself. Some of the younger townspeople began dancing, and gradually, hesitantly, a few brave souls invited the German prisoners to join them. Young Liesel accepted an invitation from a teenage boy whose grandfather had emigrated from Hamburg. They danced awkwardly, both hyper-aware of the historical weight of the moment, but also both simply young and momentarily able to forget the larger context of war and enmity. The festival continued into the evening, with lanterns strung between the buildings casting warm golden light over the celebration. Elsa found herself sitting on a bench near the bandstand, exhausted but unable to deny the strange sense of accomplishment she felt. The day had been difficult and emotional, filled with moments of connection and rejection in equal measure. But something significant had happened, though she struggled to name exactly what it was. Jack Brennan approached with 2 cups of hot cider, offering one to her before sitting down with a respectful distance between them. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the dancers and listening to the music. Then Brennan asked a question that had clearly been troubling him. Did she miss Germany? Did she want to go home when the war ended? Elsa considered the question carefully before answering. She missed certain things about Germany, she explained in her improving English. She missed her family desperately, worried about them constantly. She missed the landscape of her childhood, the architecture, the familiar rhythms of life in Munich. But she did not miss the Germany that had existed for the past decade. She did not miss the fear that had permeated everything, the constant vigilance about what you said and who might be listening. She did not miss watching her country transform into something she no longer recognized. Brennan nodded slowly, then shared his own complicated feelings about heritage and belonging. His grandmother had loved Germany but had never wanted to return, even for a visit. She had told him that sometimes you had to leave a place to preserve your best memories of it, that going back could destroy the idealized version you carried in your heart. She had created a version of Germany in her Texas kitchen, selecting the parts of her heritage worth keeping while leaving behind the parts that no longer served her. Elsa felt tears threatening again. She realized that she was experiencing something similar in this Texas prison camp. In these baking sessions with American civilians, she was discovering which parts of her German identity were essential, and which were merely the product of her particular historical moment. Traditional recipes, the language, certain values about craftsmanship and precision, these felt fundamental to who she was. But nationalism, the belief in German superiority, the acceptance of authoritarianism, these she could release without losing herself. The conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who informed them that it was time for the prisoners to return to the camp. As Elsa stood to leave, an elderly man approached her quickly. He pressed something into her hand, a worn recipe card written in German script. His mother's strudel recipe, he explained. She had brought it from Germany in 1873, and he wanted Elsa to have it. He said that recipes were meant to be shared, meant to travel across borders and generations, meant to connect people rather than divide them. Elsa clutched the fragile card carefully as she boarded the truck. She looked back at the festival, at the lights and music and people who had welcomed her despite everything. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to consider a possibility that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Perhaps home was not just the place where you were born. Perhaps it could also be the place where you chose to become who you wanted to be. May 8th, 1945, arrived with the sudden force of a thunderstorm breaking summer heat. Victory in Europe Day. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was finally over. In the camp outside Fredericksburg, the news was met with complicated silence among the German prisoners. Relief that the killing had stopped mingled with grief for a defeated homeland and fear about what came next. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called an assembly in the main hall that afternoon. She stood before the 23 women with an expression that mixed professional authority with genuine emotion. The war was over, she announced through the interpreter. Though most of the women had learned enough English by now to understand without translation, Germany had been defeated, the Nazi regime had fallen, and Allied forces occupied the country. Within weeks, arrangements would be made for their repatriation. They would be going home. The reaction was not what Hayes had expected. Instead of joy or relief, she saw fear flash across many faces. Elsa felt her stomach drop as the reality of returning to Germany began to crystallize. What Germany would they be returning to? The letters from home had become increasingly desperate over recent months. Hamburg was rubble. Berlin was destroyed. Munich had been bombed repeatedly. The infrastructure was devastated. Food was scarce, and millions of displaced persons wandered across the continent, searching for surviving family members. More troubling were the reports about how Germans who had served the regime in any capacity were being treated. Denazification programs were identifying and punishing those who had collaborated with Hitler's government. Women who had served in auxiliary corps were viewed with suspicion and sometimes hostility. Elsa and her companions had joined the Women's Auxiliary, believing they were serving their country's defense. Now they would return as representatives of a regime that had committed atrocities they were only beginning to fully comprehend. That evening, the German women gathered in their barracks to discuss what returning home would mean. Some, like Ingrid Vogel, remained committed to repatriation despite the difficulties. Germany was their homeland, she argued. They belonged there regardless of the current conditions. To remain in America would be to abandon their country when it needed them most, to choose comfort and safety over duty and solidarity. But others expressed profound reluctance about returning. Clara spoke quietly about her sister's last letter, which had described Hamburg as an endless landscape of ruins where survivors lived in basements and fought over scraps of food. Greta's family restaurant in Bavaria had been destroyed. Her parents were living with relatives, and there was no work, no money, no prospects for rebuilding. Young Liesel had received notification that her fiancé had been killed in Italy during the final weeks of the war, leaving her with no family waiting for her return, except elderly parents who could barely feed themselves. Elsa remained silent during most of the discussion, her mind racing through possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider before. She thought about the life she had built in Texas over the past 8 months, the friendships she had formed, the skills she had developed, the sense of purpose she had found in the kitchen. She thought about Jack Brennan and Dorothy Martinez and little Tommy and all the people who had shown her kindness when they had every reason to treat her as an enemy. 3 days after the surrender announcement, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes received an unexpected delegation in her office. Jack Brennan, Dorothy Martinez, Helen Kowalski, and 6 other local civilians who had participated in the baking program requested a meeting. What they proposed was unprecedented and potentially impossible, but Hayes listened carefully as Brennan explained their idea. Several of the German prisoners had expressed interest in remaining in America if such a thing were legally possible. The local community wanted to sponsor them, offering employment, housing, and assistance with the complex immigration process. Brennan and the others had consulted with lawyers and discovered that while there was no clear precedent for enemy prisoners of war seeking to immigrate to the United States immediately after hostilities ended, there was also no explicit legal prohibition against it. Hayes was silent for a long moment after hearing the proposal. The legal complexities were staggering. The political implications were potentially explosive. Allowing German prisoners to remain in America while American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific Theater could provoke public outrage. Yet she also understood the humanitarian argument. These women faced uncertain and potentially dangerous futures in devastated Germany. They had skills, work ethic, and established connections in the community. Most importantly, they wanted to stay. She told the delegation she would need to consult with higher military authorities and government officials in Washington. The decision was far to express gratitude that felt too immense for words. She spoke in English now. Her accent still strong, but her vocabulary and confidence vastly improved from 8 months earlier. She thanked everyone who had shown faith in women who arrived as enemies but were being welcomed as neighbors. She acknowledged the complexity of their decision to stay, the guilt they felt about leaving Germany during its reconstruction, the grief they carried for families they might never see again. But she also spoke about hope and second chances. She talked about how America had shown them that people could choose to become better than their worst moments, that redemption was possible when communities were willing to offer it. She promised that they would work to deserve the faith that had been placed in them, that they would contribute to their adopted home while honoring the heritage they brought with them. 20 years later, in 1965, Elsa Hoffman Brennan stood in the commercial kitchen of her successful catering business in Fredericksburg, preparing strudel for the annual Harvest Festival. She was now 56 years old, an American citizen, and the wife of Jack Brennan, whom she had married in 1948, after a cautious courtship that honored both their genuine affection and the complicated history that brought them together. They had 2 children, both of whom spoke German as fluently as English and understood themselves as bridges between 2 cultures. The catering business had grown from the simple baking sessions in the prison camp kitchen into a thriving enterprise that employed 15 people and served clients throughout Central Texas. Elsa specialized in traditional German pastries but also incorporated Mexican, Polish, and American recipes learned from the women who had welcomed her 2 decades earlier. Her business had become a symbol of Fredericksburg's unique cultural heritage, where German traditions planted by 19th-century immigrants had been enriched by the unexpected arrival of 20th-century refugees. Clara Weber owned a successful restaurant in San Antonio with her husband, a former soldier who had returned from the war and fallen in love with the quiet German woman who made the best schnitzel he had ever tasted. Greta Newman had taken over the German bakery in Fredericksburg when its original owner retired, maintaining traditions while adapting to changing American tastes. Young Liesel Braun had earned a teaching degree and now taught German language and culture at the local high school, sharing her heritage with students whose own German ancestors had emigrated generations earlier. Not all the stories had happy endings. 2 of the 12 women who stayed had eventually returned to Germany, unable to overcome homesickness and guilt about abandoning their families. One had died tragically in a car accident, but most had built successful lives, raised families, and become integral parts of their communities. They had proven that redemption was possible, that former enemies could become friends, and that cultural heritage could be honored without nationalism or hatred. The archive at the local historical society now contained extensive documentation of what became known as the Strudel diplomacy program. Historians studied it as an early example of soft cultural exchange during wartime, a grassroots effort that anticipated the formal programs that would above her authority level. But she promised to present their case as favorably as possible, and to allow the interested prisoners to formally petition for permission to remain. She could guarantee nothing except that she would try. That evening, Hayes called the German prisoners together and explained what had been proposed. She emphasized that this was not yet an approved option, that it might be denied at any level of the bureaucracy, and that even if approved, it would involve extensive paperwork and legal processes. She asked those interested in pursuing this possibility to meet with her individually over the following days to discuss their situations and motivations. 12 women requested individual meetings. Elsa was among them. When she sat across from Hayes in the small office, she struggled to articulate why she wanted to stay in a country that had been her enemy, why she wanted to abandon her homeland during its darkest hour. Finally, she spoke about transformation and redemption. In Germany, she would always be marked by her service to the Nazi regime, always suspected and judged for choices she had made when she was younger and understood less about the world. In America, she had been given an opportunity to define herself differently, to build an identity based on who she was becoming rather than who she had been. Hayes listened without judgment, taking careful notes. She asked difficult questions about Elsa's family in Germany, about whether staying in America meant abandoning parents who might need her help. Elsa admitted this was the hardest part of her decision. She loved her family but could not save them by returning to share their suffering. Perhaps she could help them more by building a stable life in America and sending money in packages once she was established. The bureaucratic process took 4 months of uncertainty and paperwork. Letters traveled between Fredericksburg, Washington, and various military commands across the Atlantic. Lawyers drafted arguments, politicians debated the optics of allowing enemy prisoners to immigrate, while American POWs were still being repatriated from Japanese camps. Public opinion was sharply divided, with some viewing it as an act of Christian charity and others seeing it as a betrayal of American soldiers who had died fighting Germans. During this waiting period, the prisoners existed in a strange limbo. They were no longer treated as enemy combatants, but not yet free civilians. The 11 women who had chosen repatriation left in June, boarding ships bound for Bremen with mixed emotions. Ingrid Vogel departed with her head held high, telling the remaining women they were cowards and traitors, but others left with tears and embraces, understanding their companions' choices even if they could not make the same ones themselves. The 12 who remained continued their baking sessions, now working under a new classification as civilian detainees pending immigration resolution. Jack Brennan formally offered Elsa employment at the Triple Creek Ranch, where she would manage the kitchen and teach cooking classes to local women. Dorothy Martinez arranged for Clara to work in her family's restaurant in San Antonio. Greta received an offer from a German bakery in Fredericksburg, whose aging owner needed help maintaining the traditional recipes his customers expected. In August, approval finally came through. The 12 women would be granted special immigration status, allowing them to remain in the United States as German nationals seeking citizenship. They would need to complete 5 years of continuous residency, demonstrate good moral character, learn English fluently, and pass examinations on American history and government. They would be monitored closely during this probationary period, but they would be free to work, to live independently, and to begin building permanent lives in America. The day they received their immigration papers, Jack Brennan organized a celebration at the Triple Creek Ranch. The entire community that had supported their petition attended, along with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had fought tirelessly through military and governmental channels to make this outcome possible. Tables were laden with food representing the cultural exchange that had made everything possible. German strudel sat alongside Mexican tamales, Polish pierogi, and traditional American apple pie. Elsa stood before the gathering and attempted to later characterize American foreign policy. Elsa had been interviewed multiple times, always emphasizing that the transformation happened not through grand political gestures, but through simple human connections formed over flour and sugar and shared memories of grandmother's kitchens. On this particular festival day, Elsa noticed a young German couple standing at her booth, speaking to each other in the familiar accents of her homeland. They were exchange students at the University of Texas, they explained, participating in a program that brought German and American students together to study history and culture. They had read about her story in their coursework and wanted to meet her in person. Elsa invited them behind the counter and showed them how to stretch strudel dough properly, her hands moving through motions that had become second nature over 40 years of practice. As she taught, she told them the story of how baking had saved her, how food had built bridges when politics had built walls, how the simple act of sharing recipes had transformed enemies into family. The young Germans listened with tears in their eyes, understanding that they were witnessing living history, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when people chose connection over division, when they remembered that humanity transcended nationality, and when they recognized that home could be both where you came from and where you chose to build your future.